Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our presentation today. My name is Lauren Mesley, and I'll be presenting alongside my colleague, Maya Eisenberg. Our presentation is going to look at evaluating LGBTQ/queer bias and representation in teen literature. Here is a list of the presentation's learning objectives. Basically, these are what we hope you will take away from the presentation, and they'll guide the structure of the presentation. The first one is going to be identifying bias and harmful queer representation in young adult literature, so you can make sure you don't have books that may be harmful for queer teens in your collection. Second, we're going to look at the trajectory of queer representation in books written for teens, which will include looking at some of the gaps that still remain in representation. And third, we're going to look at some good examples of queer representation in young adult literature. Before we jump in, here are some professional competencies we hope our presentation will help strengthen. The first being knowledge of diverse literature and inclusive collections. We want library staff to demonstrate a deep knowledge of diverse books, including queer representation in teen literature, and evaluate texts for authenticity and inclusivity. The second being critical literacy and bias evaluation skills. This just means library staff will be able to apply critical thinking practices to analyze texts for bias, representation, and power structures. And the last is a commitment to ongoing professional development. This just involves keeping up to date on the latest books and the evolving representation standards in these books. Okay, let's jump into our first learning objective. I've listed a couple of the most common harmful stereotypes when it comes to queer representation in literature. The most common being that the token gay character in a novel has a tragic ending. This includes themes like assault, suicide, murder, dying alone, being diagnosed with an incurable disease. Basically, queer characters usually suffer and almost often die. Even in the less extreme instances, early young adult books featured queer characters who were socially isolated and rejected. Which leads me to my next point that harmful representation includes books where homophobia is like the key plot element in a queer character story, or it's a major theme. And this is problematic in conjunction with the fact that often a character's queerness is their only personality trait. It's like the only thing we know about them. While it's important to acknowledge the history of oppression, violence, and discrimination that queer people have faced, the suffering of queer people can't be the only narrative we have for them. We don't want teens to think that suffering is the only outcome of being queer. We want them to know that they deserve joy. And this last bullet point under harmful stereotypes is kind of an obvious one, but any narrative that implies that being queer is a choice or a phase is just untrue. In YA novels, sometimes queerness is associated with teen rebellion, which implies that teens will eventually grow out of it and follow social norms. And with transness, particularly, there may be this narrative that the character feels like they were born in the wrong body, kind of suggesting that it's their body that needs to be changed rather than the societal gender norms that make them feel like they can't be who they really are in their own body. And one last thing I wanted to leave with you is Emily Corbett's idea of the problem novel. The problem novel is a genre of book written by people who are not in the margins themselves, so they come from the majority. And the purpose of them is to introduce culturally marginalized identities to mainstream teenage readers. They are stories where the character's identity is basically the plot, and they present the identity as the problem in and of itself. Dr. Corbett observes that trans problem novels employ transness as an obstacle to happiness from a cisgender point of view. And of course, these novels feature similar harmful themes, as I've cited before, coming out, familial rejection, abuse and discrimination, and the prohibitive cost of gender affirming medical treatment. Okay, that's all for me. I'll pass it on to my colleague Maya.
Thanks, Lauren. I'd like to now take a step back and look at the broader trajectory of queer representation in young adult literature, as well as identify where some gaps still remain today. So, as Lauren discussed, queer stories in young adult literature have historically been portrayed through negative stereotypes and tragic narratives, which reinforce the idea that queerness was something inherently difficult or dangerous rather than something that could be joyful or fulfilling. Another common pattern in early YA Lit was that characters were defined almost entirely by their queerness. So instead of being fully developed individuals with interests, relationships, and goals, their identity became the central conflict of the story. This is closely connected to the idea of the problem novel, where a character's identity is treated as the main issue that needs to be solved. We also see historical issues with authorship. For many years, queer characters, especially trans characters, were written primarily by authors who did not share these identities, which often led to stories being shaped by outside perspectives rather than lived experiences. Even though representation has improved greatly in recent decades, there are still gaps. Notably, modern queer YA lit lacks significant intersectionality. So many queer YA stories still center white, able-bodied, middle-class characters, which absolutely does not reflect the diversity of real queer communities. Queer youth of color, disabled queer youth, and those from different religious or socioeconomic backgrounds are still very much underrepresented. There are also still structural barriers that limit LGBTQ representation in books, specifically for kids and teens. Publishing restrictions, censorship, and challenges to queer books in schools' libraries continue to affect which stories are available to young readers. In some cases, books with themes of sexuality are restricted or moved to different sections, which greatly limits access. The last major gap that I want to discuss is the just happens to be gay narrative, which has become more prevalent in YA Lit in the past couple decades as a response to the previous trend of characters having been defined solely by their queerness. Well, of course, it's important for queer characters to exist naturally in stories. It's also important to acknowledge that identity doesn't exist in a vacuum. Queer characters presumably navigate social expectations, relationships, and institutions that shape their experiences just like anyone else. Ignoring the complexity of existing within a marginalized identity does not represent most real queer people's experiences. So now that we've examined the problems in queer YA lit, let's shift our focus to what positive queer representation actually looks like. One of the most important features of strong representation is diversity, not just in characters, but also in narratives and authorship. Positive representation includes stories that reflect a wide range of identities, including differences in race, gender identity, disability, religion, and culture. It also includes authors whose lived experiences bring authenticity and depth to the characters that they're creating. Another key characteristic is multidimensionality. In positive queer representation, characters are fully developed individuals with personalities, goals, friendships, interests, and hardships that extend beyond their identity. Their queerness is still important as it affects how they move through the world, but it is not the only thing that defines them. And finally, positive representation includes hopeful narratives. This doesn't mean that stories need to ignore hardship or conflict, but it does mean that queer characters should have access to joy, belonging, and positive futures. Stories that include supportive relationships, community connections, and affirming endings help counter the long history of tragic outcomes in queer YA literature and queer media in general. So, how do we as librarians ensure that our collections contain diverse, multidimensional stories? Well, one helpful tool is referencing established selection resources. So, for example, the American Library Association's Rainbow Roundtable creates an annual Rainbow Book List, which highlights high quality books featuring LGBTQ content for children and teens. They also present the Stonewall Book Award, which recognizes outstanding literature that authentically depicts LGBTQ experiences. Another important strategy is weeding harmful or outdated books from your collection. Just as we remove books with outdated information in science or history, we also should evaluate whether certain titles contain harmful queer stereotypes or inaccurate representations. So ask yourself, is your collection due for a diversity audit? A diversity audit involves taking a close look at your collection to assess representation across identities, including sexual orientation and gender identity. It helps identify gaps, highlight strengths, and guide future purchasing decisions. Conducting regular audits ensures that collections evolve alongside current scholarship, publishing trends, and the needs of young readers. Ultimately, building an inclusive collection isn't just a one-time task. It's an ongoing process that requires a lot of reflection, evaluation, and commitment to learning and growth. We hope that this presentation was informative and will help you build a strong collection of queer young adult literature in your own library. Thanks so much for listening.